Welcome to our kitchen. Today we prepare medieval fava beans and pork from the Liber de Cucina, a cookbook written in Latin around the end of the 13th century. We start with ingredients. We need pork tenderloin, fava beans, milk, and the spices: saffron, black pepper, nutmeg, and cloves. First, we shell the fava beans and briefly boil them without salt. In the medieval sources, we find frequently the recommendation to cook the legumes 2 times, discarding the first cooking water. According to Anonimo Toscano, a text in which we find the translation into vernacular of most part of the Liber de Cucina, fava beans must boil for a short time, then they are strained, dried, and cooked again in a little water, just enough to cover the legumes. It's essential to use fava beans quite fresh, considered better than the dry ones. In addition, many authors suggest asking them to remove the potential harms, which include bloats and difficulty to digest. But actually some kinds of fava beans may be quite hard to ask, like the ones we are using for this recipe. In the medieval texts, for instance, the Flore Dietarum, written in the 11th century, and Michele Savonarola Dietetic Book, written in the 15th century, we read that there are 2 main kinds of fava beans, the common ones and others big and white, considered better. In the medieval cookbooks we find several recipes for fava beans, despite the fact that they were considered a food for peasants, as Michele Savonarola writes. The physician also reports that in Ferrara they were eaten raw with salted cheese, a very harmful habit. Meanwhile, we cut the pork tenderloin. The author doesn't specify which cut of pork to use, just to use pieces of pork. Since there are no cooking fats, you can use a cut fatter than tenderloin if you want, such as collar, belly, or even ribs. The meat in this recipe is used just to give flavor to the fava beans, and the author writes nothing about what to do with it when the legumes are done. Actually, there are several recipes in the medieval cookbooks that call for meat served with plates of legumes or vegetables, without specifying how to cook it. We chose to serve the meat with the fava beans, but you can also prepare other dishes to accompany the pork tenderloin. Then we strain the fava beans and cook them with a bit of milk and the pork tenderloin. We cooked the fava beans for about 10 minutes or a little more, considering both the first boil and the second cooking with the meat. But the cooking time can change considerably depending on the variety of fava beans and how young they are. For the pork tenderloin instead, 5 minutes are enough. So if your fava beans are big and old, add the tenderloin just towards the end. There are other ways to correct the potential harm given by the fava beans, as we read in the medical sources. The Flore Dietarum recommends adding pepper, cumin, and lard. Michele Savonarola instead salt, pepper, sage, and oil. Some cooking fats are always considered essential, and it's interesting to notice that in the recipe we are preparing today, there are no further fats. The author of the cookbook, conventionally called Anonimo Meridionale, written between the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th, probably would disapprove. In his recipe for a fava bean torta, indeed, he writes that it is essential to make it well fed, since without enough fats it would be a waste of money. Meanwhile, we steep the saffron in warm water and grind in the mortar black pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and 2 pinches of salt. The author does not specify which spices to use, except saffron, but these are the most common in his cookbook. Other spices frequently used by this anonymous author are ginger and cinnamon. If you want to know more about fava beans in the medieval sources with our translations of passages from dietetic books and further recipes, check out our Patreon page, in which you also find several articles and a complete translation of the Flora Dietarum and other medieval and ancient sources. If you're interested in ancient foods, check out our book, Ancient Roman Cooking, available on Amazon in English and Italian. To support our work, you can also buy us a beer or purchase our merchandise. You find all the links in the description below. When the fava beans are cooked through, we pound them in the mortar, then we add the spices and salt, the residual cooking liquid, and the saffron. One of the most common methods for fava beans, in the same way as in the antiquity, is the preparation of a pulse, which is a mash or a cream made with cereals or legumes, that we also find in the recuquinarium. To make properly a pulse, it is necessary to overcook the ingredients, then mash them with a spoon or a ladle. In this case, being the fava beans quite tender, the cooking time is short, but if you use dry legumes, you will need a longer time, because they must be cooked until they almost dissolve. We recently prepared an ancient Roman plate with peas and meatballs, following similar principles, and in the past a recipe with fava beans. You find the links in the description below. The dish was great, despite its simplicity, and very tasty. The milk makes this pulse richer and slightly sweet, and the flavor of saffron blends perfectly with the other spices and balances well the hint of bitterness given by the fava beans. Possibly with fatter meat, it would be even better. We served it with millet bread and good wine, to make a simple dinner that surely would be appreciated in the Middle Age. You find the links to the recipe for the millet bread in the description below. If you're interested in ancient foods and flavors, subscribe our channel and consider supporting us on Patreon.